And welcome back, everyone, for what is the second and closing panel for today. And just a reminder before we start that folks can enter Q&A, and we will do our best to get to those questions if there's time, and to share the resources with all of you on the website after the event. And I also wanted to, before we kick off this panel, just note that the second course code is RIGHTS 51, so RIGHTS 51, recognizing it's May 1st. And I'm really thrilled now to turn it over to Erika Sasson, the Director of the Restorative Practices at the Center for Court Innovation, for our second panel, Restorative Justice in Practice, Pathways to Racial Justice at the Local Level, which will take some of the concepts we heard from Margaret this morning and some of the ideas that we heard in the first panel as well, and talk about specific initiatives that are happening right now. What is the transformative possibility, and where can we go from here? So thank you so much, Erika and panelists.
Good morning, everybody. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you to Columbia. Is it working? Can you hear me? Yes? Good, great. I'm really honored to be here. This morning was really riveting. Thanks to everyone who presented. I want to just frame our conversation that we're going to have right now about restorative justice, about going local, digging deeper into how we can do the things we want to do right now. And I want to just mention, obviously, we're disappointed to be here virtually. I want to say something about our city that is grieving, and just send a big shout out to everybody who's joining us virtually, we're all connected to that grief and that shared grief in our city, which is really hard to put words into. And I don't believe there are any silver linings to any kind of tragedy like that, but like we're experiencing right now. But I do think there's some writing on the wall that we need to acknowledge. And I think it's connected right now to what we're doing here in restorative justice. And for me, that connection is, and not to use this word too much, but that we are all interconnected, that we do impact each other, that nobody is outside looking in. We're all on the inside of something here. And I think that that's what restorative justice has been trying to say for so long. You can't push people out, and you can't stop taking responsibility for being part of something and doing your share. So that has been something that I've been seeing in the last 6-7 weeks. And again, as we start, I also want to just, restorative justice gets a lot of its legs and spirit and energy from Indigenous movements and from Indigenous practices. And I want to honor those and my own teachers in that, and thank Nadia for the beautiful land acknowledgement that you made earlier. So we start there at a place of interconnectedness, of understanding that we're all part of something, that we can't send people out, and that this comes from Indigenous practices. And I want to connect it a little bit. There are so many connections from what we've been talking about this morning. I want to say that last comment from Justin on self-determination feels really important. We're going to talk a lot about restorative justice and on centering the people who've been impacted by something. And that centering, to me, is connected to Indigenous movements that are based in self-determination. So we think about the self-determination of the collective and self-determination of the individual. And these are some of the connections that we're making in restorative justice. I think it's also really important to link it to what Judge Burnham said this morning, how we connect individual harm and historical harm. And I'm going to ask the panelists to think about the connections between the individual, the historical, the collective as they make their remarks. You know, we do harm to one another, we are in relationship with one another, and those relationships are centered in our generations, in our ancestry, and our historical harm. And that duality between individual and collective, I think, is what has been most interesting to me to be in the restorative justice movement, is to always hold those two pieces of being an individual, being responsible for your share, and then seeing your share lit up in your context and in your history, and right now in our city. So with that, I'd love us to pivot into the local. We have a really exciting panel. And I also just want to thank Columbia Law School for having the foresight of creating a panel that has a cross section of issues. So, you know, I feel like we talk a lot in the criminal legal world with people who work in that field, or you know, we're all often so siloed. And right now we're going to talk about criminal legal implications. We're going to talk about health. We're going to talk about child welfare. We're going to talk about human rights. And then we're going to do all of that in this panel right now with the context of what you've just heard before about transitional justice and reparations, and structural inequities. And so again, so Joanne, thank you for having me, and thank you for designing something in which we can really see the connections that we're talking about, so that we stop operating as if it's an individual moment, an individual person who is responsible for this individual thing. So I really want to hit that hard. I'm also, thank you to Justin's niece for making noise, because I'm living in full terror of what could be coming through the door at any moment. So that is why I'm speaking so quickly, but I can't wait to mute myself. I want to introduce our amazing panel right now. We have Brett Taylor, who I've known for many, many years, who's the Senior Advisor of Problem Solving Justice at the Center for Court Innovation, where we share our offices. He's a former public defender. I think he understands the role of the lawyer, the litigator, the zero-sum way that our adversarial system has set the landscape. And he now works empowering communities to think about more equitable justice system outcomes, and he does it in a range of ways. We will next hear from Ivelyse Andino, who's an Afro-Latina health equity innovator born and raised in the Bronx, the founder and CEO of Radical Health, and importantly, a commissioner on the New York City Commission on Gender Equity. Amazing to be hearing from her. So we'll hear again on different levels. We're going to move to Erin Miles-Cloud, who's the co-director and co-founder of Movement for Family Power. I am excited to hear the links that Erin is going to make to child welfare. She was a family defense attorney at the Bronx Defenders. And she is now moving to think about how structural violence impacts all of this with her analysis, and has come to learn that our foster system is one of the most profoundly racist institutions in America. We're going to end our panels with Carmelyn Malalis, who is the chair and commissioner of the New York City Commission on Human Rights, who has been working to enforce New York City's human rights law, which is one of the most protective rights laws in the country. So I think we should be really proud of that. And I think we should also be proud of the way she is enforcing it, which is bringing restorative justice measures, looking at the individual and the cultural and the systemic issues at play when things are violated. And I've had the pleasure of working with her and her staff to think about some of those things. I'm really excited to hear about the restorative justice measures that she has been pioneering. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this to Brett, who's going to start us off, and I will try to keep time, and I will be gentle about it. Brett, are you able to unmute and share your screen?
I think I'm unmuted.
You're good.
And I think I'm sharing my screen. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge I am not an academic. I'm more of a practitioner. I'm also not an expert in restorative justice or in peacemaking. We know how to find those folks and how to try to operationalize the things that they've taught us. What we're trying to share here is just a little simple story of why we took on and how we operationalized a little peacemaking program in Red Hook, Brooklyn, New York. And I'm going to move a little fast. I will slow down in a couple of spots, and the slides will be available. So, okay. So for those who don't know where Red Hook is, it's very close to downtown Manhattan's financial district. It's probably less than a mile as the crow flies, just giving you that perspective. We are at the Center for Court Innovation. We created a group called the Tribal Justice Exchange. And the whole concept there was to share the lessons we'd been learning, mostly in problem-solving courts, and to share those with the tribal justice systems that will ask for that type of help. And then specifically, one particular tribal court judge, B.J. Jones, said to us, hey, what you guys are doing with some of the work at the Center for Court Innovation is a lot like what we're doing in Indian country. You guys are focusing on helping and healing people, not hurting and punishing them. And we always take that as kind of our marching orders going forward. So the other thing we were supposed to do at the Tribal Justice Exchange was learn practices that these indigenous cultures had been using for generations, and seeing if any of those practices would be able to translate into a state court setting. And so what was fortuitous at the time was the Chief Justice of the Navajo Nation had reached out to us and had asked us to teach them about our community courts, our community court approach, and if we could come out and work with them to help them launch a community court, which we ultimately did. And during that time, we learned about this thing when I was learning about their justice system, that they had this thing called peacemaking, which was very intriguing to me. And so as we got to know their practitioners and they came back to Red Hook to study some of the things we did, one of their peacemakers came on that trip. And I asked if he would speak to some community members because I knew this community very well from working there, living there. I was a baseball coach there, very engaged in some community events. And I knew this community would really take on to this peacemaking concept. But I wanted them to hear from a peacemaker themselves before making those determinations and hear what they had to say. And I just want to share one of my favorite pictures. This was the peacemaker Stanley. And as you could see from Erika, we love Stanley. And the guy behind her is Ray. He's a trainer for us who has come to New York multiple times to do trainings for our peacemaking program. So for those who aren't familiar, real basic peacemaking, I'm not going to read all this stuff. This is all available, but it's relationship focused. It's about, it's very non-adversarial. You need to focus on storytelling. There's no rules of evidence, no time-bound limits, and it's very different from mediation in that mediation is very issue-focused, whereas peacemaking is relationship-focused. So some of the goals we had set when we decided to try and launch this program were these four following points. We wanted to focus on the relationships that created the tension that whatever created the court case. We also wanted to make sure victims had a voice and were able to be heard, because that is something a lot of victims and victim advocates say does not happen in our court system. We wanted to hold participants accountable, and I want to focus on that word participants, because a lot of times everyone wants to focus on a defendant, whereas a lot of times these issues that come into court, it's not a 100% to 0% fault. And there's sometimes both sides have contributed to that situation. And it just is a fairer way to make sure everybody is held accountable for their choices and their behavior in a particular situation. And most importantly to me was empowering the community, because as a public defender, I saw that the court system neither treated the people that came to court with respect or treated the communities from where they came, or the communities that these court systems were meant to be serving. They never treated them with the proper respect due to them. I'm going to have a lot of pictures in this PowerPoint. This is out at the Colville Reservation in Eastern Washington. That's one of our mentors leading a community circle. This was our national roundtable that helped launch our program. So we studied the concept of peacemaking after learning about it from the Navajo Nation. And we had a national roundtable where we invited a lot of peacemakers from various tribes across the country and including in Canada, as well as a couple of state court, a judge and a clerk, to see if the concept of peacemaking that works well in indigenous communities could translate into not just a state court setting, but into an urban setting. And the thing that I always tell people that amazed me the most about this roundtable was every time someone from the state court side would try and show, hey, you know, we have these serious things or this issue, and as a way of trying to see if they can't be done, every time our peacemakers said, no problem, peacemaking can handle that. And so I like to share this picture because the guy on the right is a judge from Cake, Alaska. And at the end of our roundtable, we asked all the participants, many of whom we had worked with and had relationships with. And when they all felt that this was something we could go forward with, we asked them, are you guys okay with us trying this? Because if you're not, our relationships to you are more important than us trying this project in Brooklyn. And the judge on the right, whose name ironically is Michael Jackson, he has this big booming voice, as you can imagine. And as everyone was going around the table expressing their approval of what we were trying to do, Judge Jackson stood up and said, it's about time you all tried learning from us for a change. And that was our to-go moment. So, and this was our assembled crowd. These were some of our concerns about doing this. The cultural appropriation I mentioned. Could we find appropriate elders in New York? Could we create the kinship and the systems that a lot of the indigenous cultures use in terms of their clans and their culture? The pushback from the justice system stakeholders was really key to us. You know, worrying about a judge who would want to be part of this. For those who know Judge Calabrese in Red Hook, he loves to be engaged in the court actions. He's a very good-hearted man. And he initially was at that roundtable and he thought he would have some role in the peacemaking process, but we told him, no, you're not going to be able to do that because this is about community and not about the judge. And to his credit, he understood that and stepped back. The finding food, you know, as we were learning about this process, we kept being told, you have to feed people before you do any of these circles. And we were like, yeah, we have federal grants. We're not allowed to talk about food or water. But then as we got closer, we realized we need this food because that's what our mentors kept telling us. And I want to give Erika and some of our early staff members a shout out because for our first several sessions, they would cook food and make food and bring them to these circles until we finally found a little grant to help us out with that. This is what was really important, was getting the key stakeholders to rethink how we can handle cases that are in a criminal court case. So I want to make it clear that the cases that we give to our community peacemakers, these are not diversion cases. These are not some little cases where we could either dismiss it or give it to the community. These were actual filed cases by a prosecutor that had an arraignment and were set to go for the whole trial process that we would then give to the community. And some of the pushbacks we were getting, our defense attorney, who had been a colleague of mine, laughed at us, quite frankly, and said, get out of here. People in Brooklyn aren't going to sit around and do touchy-feely feelings talk. You know, this is crazy, but we'll give it a try. It's not putting my guy in jail. The prosecutor wanted it to be just one of many things that they could do. And also with the defense attorney, as most defense attorneys, we always try to get the least amount of anything possible. And we had to tell them, we can't tell you how long these sessions are going to be. They will determine themselves how long these sessions are going to be. And then I also, I told you about Judge Calabrese wanting to be in the participatory part of this, but we had to get him to pull back. The point I want to make about the change that the systems actors have to be involved in is this concept of control, because those who practice in court systems, especially criminal court, know that about 75% of what goes on in a criminal court setting is all about the state being able to exert its authority and its control over individuals. And what we were asking those folks to do is give up that control and to cede it to the community where it rightly belongs, because keeping in mind, these systems were set up to serve communities, not the other way around. And thankfully, we had relationships with these folks where we were able to gain some trust to get them to at least try our approach. And so I like this picture because the woman on the left with the ponytail is the defense attorney. The woman on the right is the judge. The defense attorney became one of our best supporters. The prosecutor, we actually ended up using when we started another site up in Syracuse, and the prosecutor didn't want to do this. She actually flew up there and told him, are you nuts? This has been the best thing that ever happened to my office. We're able to resolve cases in a very meaningful way and in a way that lasts much longer than the regular court process. These are just some of the reasons why I think this works. First of all, we went into the community asking for help. We didn't go in there arrogant with telling them we had things figured out. We went in with a much more humble approach. And another issue is it's about relationships. It's about looking forward, not looking backwards. And like I said, it's about helping and healing, not punishing and hurting. I do want to just say that if you're going to do something like this, stick to the model. Do not let people try to bastardize what you're doing or make it comfortable for them. And in fact, when I do this kind of work, I always know we're on the right path if those in power are feeling a little uncomfortable about what we're proposing, because that means we're shaking up the status quo, which means we're probably doing something a little more right than a little more wrong. And I just like to share these kind of pictures to show what a peacemaking training looks like. And this was one of our last groups. And I'm getting the sweet 1 minute finger from Erika, so I'm going to stop. But I do want to just say, those who are going to ask about outcomes, we would love to find some funders to evaluate this program. What we do know is those people who do go through peacemaking, they do what they're supposed to do. And my belief is it's because the defendant is part of the process. He is not a passive person, but he's much more active and he's involved in those decisions. And that's why they do it, because they have agreed that this is the best way to resolve these cases. And I'm going to end from here.
Thanks so much, Brett. So as we're trying to do, have a kind of broader analysis about what all of this means, what is this self-determination that you're talking about from a defendant's perspective? I want to move into the self-determination of families. So I'm going to ask Erin to speak next and connect some of these these ideas and this work into the child welfare system. So please welcome Erin.
Hey everybody, I'm going to try to share my screen. I'm going to try to be savvy with all this. So give me a second.
You got it. I did it. You could do it.
Yeah, that's what we're here for, a community. We're just here to make it work together. All right. Y'all can see my screen. Just nod your head. Yeah, cool. So my name is Erin Miles Cloud. I use she, her pronouns. I am currently in Baltimore City, though I reside in the South Bronx. So Ivelyse, shout out. We are neighbors. Our kids have gone to school together. And I just want to give gratitude to this space and gratitude to the Piscataway people who are, that is the land that I'm currently sitting on right now. I co-founded an organization called Movement for Family Power. And the reason why we did is because the United States has the distressing distinction of having the greatest number of legal orphans in the world. 2017, more than 500,000 parents were entangled in the child welfare system. And in 2020, nearly the same amount of children languish in foster care. And that number has been growing and continues to grow. And it has been growing from all the things that we've been talking about today. You know, the pernicious war on drugs, racism, sexism, all the isms, all the things. But often is exempted from the analysis, though anyone who lives in a community color is a Black, brown, low-income person in America knows that whether or not the people that are attending this as lawyers exempted from the analysis is very much a part of our lives. Our organization works to end the policing and punishment of families and support the dignity and integrity of all families. And our work is a part of a small part of a broader movement. And I think this is really important because I think oftentimes when we talk about movement lawyering, we can still center lawyers and we can still think of ourselves as architects of this movement, when really we are just participants. And the goal is to dissipate the privilege in which we have from an institution that was created from white supremacy and not from origins of our community or indigenous people. And it's rooted in abolition and also the work of our elders and the vision of our peers. So when we ground our work in all of those theories, those people, and those processes. We carry out our work in 3 ways. One, building out loving and healthy community amongst people working to shrink the foster system. So just kind of shout out to my comrade Monifa in the first panel and thinking about how do we build alignment? How do we build solidarity? And value alignment doesn't mean that everyone is with you. Value alignment means how do we work together in a team? And that work of building community is a part of our work. 2, raising social consciousness around the harms of the foster system and to support the reclaiming of safe and healthy families. I think that's a very co-opted term. And oftentimes when people think, oh, wow, you want to abolish the foster system, their immediate thought is that you want children to be unsafe. And the fact that those two concepts are married in our consciousness in America is deeply problematic and extraordinarily violent. And third is disrupting and curtailing what we call foster system pipelines and reducing the level of harm inflicted. We have an abolitionist theory of change, and we come from the theory and body of work of Dorothy Roberts, of Black female scholars, of womanist scholars behind us. And nothing that I'm going to say today is my own thought. It is a building off a collective set of wisdom of many, many people before me. And so I like to think about this work that we do from the framework of Dorothy Roberts, who talks about the prison immigration systems and child welfare systems. They fray family and community bonds and strain the ability of effective communities to politically organize and resist attacks on their children and families. They're oppressive systems that work together to regulate, punish, and control the most marginalized people, fueled by a racist ideology. And so when we think about, oops, sorry guys. When we think about this system and why we need an abolitionist theory of change, I like to think of my comrade Marbre Stanley Butts of Law for Black Lives. She talks about there's no way to make change if the root of the system is toxic. That if you are a reformist and believe in reform, you're cutting at different pieces. You may cut down a branch, but it will still regrow. And we believe that if it can be built, it can be broken down. We also believe that when we're thinking about abolition theory of change, it's not just destabilizing, deconstructing, and demolishing, but as Patrisse Cullors aptly said in the Harvard Law Review article, Abolition Series, it's also incumbent upon us to repair histories of harm. And so oftentimes people misconstrue abolitionist theory of change of just the side of destruction without thinking of the side of repair. And in the work that we do, we theorize, we think about this work as we're not the ones that are going to necessarily be in the place of repair. We could support the repair. We could be someone who repairs. But like anything that is built up, and laws are just largely the construction of white men who wrote down things on pieces of paper that got typed up and became the building that we live in, we can destroy it. But it might not be the same people who replant, who build, who fertilize it, and who regrow. And so where do we live in that ecosystem of change? And so we work with an organization called Ayini Institute. Ayini Institute, Ayini's Reciprocity in Quechua, is an immigrant-led institute that works with elders and has an indigenous philosophy of change. And they think about and they study movements. When we think about movement lawyering, often we think about how does movement lawyering exist upon other different theories of lawyering. So for example, access to justice. As a public defender, that's a very traditional theory of change, that if I can get in front of a judge, I can change the law. Impact. If I have the correct plaintiff, I can make a systemic change. As movement lawyers, we're thinking of how do we build up power. But we also have to understand from organizers, what is a movement, right? What does it mean to create change? And we talked a lot in the last session about power, not law, being the biggest way that things change, the shifting of power. And so they study in the ecosystem of change that any large groundswell of change has come when 5 pieces of the ecosystem have worked together. When there's structural organizing, mass protests, inside game, alternatives, and personal transformation. As lawyers, inside game means a lot to us. You know, we think of going policy, lobbying, that makes sense. We sometimes value protesters, depending on where you lie in the scheme of progressive lawyering. And we may understand structural organizers. Now, we tend to be the type of people who discredit work in personal transformation and alternatives. And so when we think about restorative justice, when we think about transformative justice, these are actual alternatives to the system that we have, not something that we implement within the system, but how do we actually transform the white supremacist system that has really coddled our bodies and lives. When we think about personal transformation, that is the journey of healing. And so to be movement lawyers, we have to understand what has actually been in a movement theory of change. And so how do we do this on a day-to-day level? I got 2 minutes, I got this. We are right now working on a campaign to resist surveillance and reimagine support. And we're in a space of visioning, because right now we think of this work as reimagining our child welfare system. We don't think it's anything about the welfare as it being breaking down isolation and really in a space of really reimagining. We're not in the place where we could responsibly and ethically make large policy shifts, because quite frankly, It's not something that there is sustained supported funding. There is not the sustained work to galvanize the leadership of the most directly impacted people. Right now, when we're talking about breaking down jails, we are in a moment where we're freeing people from jails during COVID-19, not because of COVID, but because of the sustained organizing of Black and brown people who have been working to dismantle jails. So that is work. The two places of systemic intervention that we are seeing right now, and this is based on conversations with many, many people impacted and organizers, is that we work on both sides of the foster system. So we want to slow down, limit, ultimately eliminate people entering into the system. And we think about the inside, which is ending the permanent dissolution of families. So when we mean that we want to slow down or limit people entering the system, we're focusing on ending the needless drug testing of pregnant and parenting people. So a system that actually goes into hospital systems, drug tests pregnant people, then removes their babies from them and puts them in the child protective system versus building out treatment, building out support, and it deepens stigma. We know that what we perceive to be crimes for substance use, which are not crimes, have dropped dramatically in our criminal legal system, but yet it still constitutes a quarter of our removals in the foster system. And if you're a pregnant person who uses drugs, you have a 75% likelihood that you will enter the system and your child will be in this system for a long period of time. When we come to, and then we look at ending mandated reporting. Mandated reporting is a system of community policing that has not offered support or healing, and we build with our comrades in transformative justice about how do we transform this system and create spaces of actual healing. And I'm about to end. On the other end, we think about ending the permanent dissolution. So really keeping families intact. The Adoption Safe Families Act was the most violent acts that entered into child welfare when 40% of the system was Black. And it means there's a timeline to reunify with the children within 15 months, which is when the issues are about poverty, when the issues are about substance use or mental health, an unreasonable timeline. So the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls has been our partner in that work as we continue to build that out. If you want to learn more about that, this is where I get like my commercial, go to www.movementforfamilypower.org.
Thank you so much. I share Nadia's pain right now. I want to listen to everybody for much, much longer. I'm going to turn it to Ivelyse. I can't think of a more important time to tie what we are living through and even what we are hearing all day today to health equity. So without further ado, Ivelyse, if you want to take the stage.
Mute myself. This is great. I'm going to share my, you can see my whole desktop. Sweet. All right, you can see my screen. We're good here. I can't see anyone, so, All right, well, I'm Ivelyse, or Ivelyse in Espanol, coming to you straight from the Bronx. I have to set the full stage for everyone, but I think like everyone who's come before us today has just done an incredible job about talking about not just the issues, but beliefs, honoring the land that we're on, the folks who have come before us. So it truly is an honor to be here, and thank you all for just convening this space and convening folks. So really, I mean, Radical Health is my company. We look at health equity, right, through hyper-local conversations. What we know is that in healthcare, right, experts use really big words to make things sound super complicated. The same is true in education, in law, and what we all really need are super simple things that we can understand, that are rooted in truth. But when we talked earlier about like power, right, we're gonna talk a lot about that. We know that that power and that system is designed that way, to keep it unequally distributed, to keep folks, right, from being able to access, right, the loopholes, the nuances, and even, right, we talked about self-determination. We love to say, agency. That structure is designed to keep folks, right, from acting and taking movement and taking ownership. When we look at that power dynamic, MLK in 1966 talked about of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare being the most shocking and inhumane. That was then in 1966. It was well before that. And I mean, today with coronavirus, we're seeing it today. In healthcare, we look at this, 77 million people in the US don't understand basic health information. This has nothing to do with socioeconomic status, although it's exacerbated, but also has nothing to do with education. The system is complicated. This is a fundamental trust issue. When we talk about health, and I want to be really clear here, we talk about health from a community perspective, right? So the idea that this isn't just a clinical experience, but to what Erin is talking about, how we engage with our welfare agencies. So when we look at education, when we look at all of the pieces, the environment, all of those things, right, tie into our health and largely the social determinants of health. But overall, in every one of those situations, in every one of those systems, trust is a fundamental issue. And obviously exacerbated in our communities, right, that have been historically and systemically oppressed and unheard. And so when we look at healthcare and looking at it from that whole holistic perspective, that's kind of what we're doing here at Radical Health and trying to like address that. We talked about this, right? Today we're seeing this. If you hadn't talked or known about health equity previously, I think today in this day, it is like top of the news, but also we can all, I mean, I don't know how many people have been able to get a test or done, you know, antibody testing. We can really start to see the fractures and where our society is failing us. So at Radical Health, we really believe that it's people, right, coming together plus tech, and there is something about like the digital divide, and we can talk about what that means, but combining the two and really having kind of people-enabled, people-centered initiatives that then get supplemented by tech to create change. For us, this started doing circles. We have a whole program where we knew that we weren't the experts in anything. I knew that I wasn't the expert. So many times I sat in meetings and in boardrooms and would really like look around. I was often the only woman, often the only person of color, and never once was anyone from my community or with that, you know, perspective in those meetings. So we started just listening to people. We used the indigenous practice of circles to hear, right, not just what people need, but what they want, to create space and to create power, right, or to hold space, right, for that community power to be built. For us, it's important that we combine forces. We talked earlier about, or folks talked earlier about organizing, that we use these conversations and these physical spaces as a means to pull people together. In this, it's super powerful. We've done this work across New York City in areas like Brownsville and the Bronx. And it's been really transformative because we get to facilitate and hold these conversations. We hire folks locally. So while we believe, you know, there is some power dynamics of like, who can hold a circle, who do circles belong to? We really believe that circles belong to the people, that it is in you. You are well equipped, right? No matter your pedigree, your background, where you come from. The analogy I love to use with community when I'm explaining circles, especially if they've never heard this before, it's like what happens in the parties where everyone ends up in the kitchen, even if the kitchen is this big or super, super tiny, but there's that magic in that moment. And so we really believe that circles are the people, they belong to the people, and want to encourage that. Today, we've had to change a little bit. So now we're doing circles online. This is a circle I hosted last week. So we had to build out, and while it's not necessarily the same as that in-person, you know, connection, it's helping us now as we build moments and movements and continue building the people power. And I want to be really clear, we're not, Erin said this, I'm not doing this from scratch. I'm not building anything that's brand new. This is already there. We're simply just joining forces and holding spaces to create this. We know, and we knew from those conversations that we were having, that as we were listening to people and hearing their experiences in health, that most folks did not understand how to navigate the healthcare system. When it was time, they had plenty of lived experiences, so they knew better than anyone else about their body. They knew better, you know, what they were feeling or what they had lived through. But when it came down to like entering into the system of healthcare, there was a lot of just blind spots. I'll say for myself personally, I experienced this with my mom and even when I gave birth to my son. And so what we designed was an app, and this is where the tech comes in. How do we transfer power from the top or from the textbooks into the people and give them the agency that they want and they deserve to navigate that space? So we built out this app that is a Know Your Rights for Health app. Started with pregnancy and really focusing on maternal mortality for the Black and Brown Indigenous women who are most often impacted in this case, but really wanting to give people questions so that they can navigate that space They could ask the questions like asking for a translator, asking for a second opinion, asking in the case if you're pregnant, right, is if your hospital has a hemorrhage plan, or in, you know, cases, understanding the difference, right, between a med student, a resident, and an attending, and being able to ask for those questions. When we think about radical health and what we're doing, for us, this is a transfer of power. We want to make sure that folks who are on the ground, who have the capability, the intellect, the power, we want to give that to them. Ideally, if we're successful, we no longer exist. Radical health doesn't exist because we've managed to, kind of what Erin was saying earlier, dismantle the structures that have been in place that have work on systems of oppression, not just on the people, but also the people working within the system. And when we think about how we move forward, for us, it is always, you know, community at its core, community first, building the power and loving and meeting our folks where we are. We say that we don't do this for community, we do this with community. Obviously centering health and the definitions of health, and how that is so important, that your definition of health, if I ask anyone here today, what does health mean to you? I can promise you it is vastly different than if I would have asked that 3 months ago. And knowing that those definitions change, and combining that and empowering that and with tech, right? So I think we're moving into an age where this is all important. We can't leave, and I'll say firsthand, I've always been like an analog girl in a digital world, but really incorporating the technology into this as well. I will say, this is my thank you screen. I will just jump on here really quickly to say that for us, it's super important, right, that you can take action now. When we talk about, right, this idea of transferring power, it is about like, what can you do? There are big things and there are small things. So even just communicating, checking in, you might not be able to facilitate a full circle, but checking in with your neighbor, asking questions. When we hear in our processes of doing circles right now, one of the things that came up, and I've been hosting circles all week long, is that right now in New York City, in the Bronx and Brooklyn, there are 70 kids under the age of 18 being held in detention. Today, in the Bronx, just a few minutes from where I am, and in Brooklyn, 70 children under 18. The fact that they are still being detained right now, I'm enraged. And just to be clear, these are all 100% are Black and Latinx children in detention in New York City. So I think it's important that, like, when we think about health, when we think about community, when you think about your work and your power, by transferring your power, you don't lose it. You actually just begin, it's like candles, right? We're just gonna keep on lighting up. So I encourage you all who are listening, everyone who's on here, take action, take steps to something. Use your voice, use your body, use your privilege. We all, I'll say for myself, I also have privilege. I have a bunch of it. And for me, it is my duty, my calling, and my honor to be able to stay here and to share that with you all and to encourage you. That's all I got.
Thank you for more righteous rage. I really appreciate that. I'm fired up and stuck in the house, but really fired up. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn to Carmelyn to close out this first piece of our panel. Carmelyn, over to you. I'm excited to hear from your point of view, what you've been seeing, what you've been planning.
Sure, thank you. First of all, I just want to say thanks to Columbia and thanks to everyone else who put together this program. I want to do a special shout out to Dana Sussman from my office, who I know has also put a lot of thought into the programming and working with Columbia on this. I will say, as I think the sole government type representative in the program, I always feel incredibly honored to be in these spaces, but to be the only government person here today, I feel incredibly honored to be in this space. You know, government sadly is, I think, woefully behind in embracing a lot of the ideas that have been discussed today. And so I'm hoping that in the 200 participants who are joining the program, that there's also a bunch of government folks, because we do have so much to learn. And Erika mentioned earlier that she has been in conversation with the Commission on Human Rights. And I think from a lot of the folks on this panel, as well as on the prior panel, I've been in one-on-one conversations with many of you, or many of them, because government really needs to embrace these ideas more. If we want to really, if people like me who want to be representative of different communities really want to have impact in government, I think we have to really be thinking outside of the box and be charting new ways that we can help reimagine what government spaces look like. I am going to share my screen. Hold on. Let's see. Hold on. There we go. There we go. Okay. So first, just to introduce more my agency. So I am the chair and commissioner for the New York City Commission on Human Rights. For folks who are not familiar with the agency, we are the city agency that enforces all of New York City's anti-discrimination and anti-harassment protections. And we do so in basically all areas of city living. In housing, in employment, in places of public accommodation, even kind of out on the street with individuals. So anywhere you live, breathe, work, exist in New York City, you are protected by our city's human rights law. We are generally considered to have one of the strongest human rights laws in the country. And one of the reasons for that is that, you know, just looking at the sheer number of categories of protection that we have under our law, we have 26. And they're varied in the different areas of jurisdiction that we have. We also have a statute that requires us to be looking at issues very broadly and to be thinking about how we can truly address discrimination and harassment where it occurs in the city. The other thing I'll say that I think is really important is that the way that our agency was structured, and we've gone through many changes over the years. We first came to be in the 1940s and have gone through several change names and different structural changes. But where we ended up is as a true human rights agency, meaning that we're not just enforcing or looking at civil rights, although we do that, and there's a law enforcement bureau at the agency that is focused on enforcing those anti-discrimination protections. And in that area, it sounds very much in the way that people generally think of civil rights law, right? So laws that say don't discriminate against people because of their membership in a protected class. Don't use criminal history in order to discriminate against somebody when they are applying for jobs. A lot of the kind of don't do this. But in addition to that, we also have a very vibrant community relations bureau. And that bureau is really about affirmatively going out into communities, working with communities on the ground to make sure that people are also understanding, you know, what should we affirmatively be doing in New York City to create inclusion? What should we affirmatively be doing in New York City? You know, certainly the law is the bare minimum. So we educate folks on what their rights and obligations are under the law. But the Bureau, in the work that it does, goes beyond that so that people have an understanding of what are best practices in workplaces, what are best practices for public accommodations and housing providers, so that if you really want to be inclusive environments for the people in your communities, you can actually do that. You know, I mentioned that we have this law that says within it that we're supposed to provide as much broad remedial protection as possible. Part of that is also the understanding that we have, you know, broad discretion and authority, and this is a section of our law that I have up on the screen, basically to order people who are seen to have violated our law or entities who have violated our law to take such affirmative action as effectuates the purposes of the human rights law. So that really goes, I think, more into ideas of kind of social contract. It goes into ideas of like real impact. We don't have to be restrained with traditional ideas of what remedies are in law enforcement, things like money relief or penalty relief. We can think more outside of the box. And while I think that that is incredibly liberating for an agency like ours, you know, it's also incredibly challenging because we are still a structure that's situated within government. And what that means is that there's still, I think, there's still very much the idea for us to respond to what the public's traditional ideas are of law enforcement. And there's oftentimes when we are looking at different types of more restorative remedies, there's a challenge because, as many people have said earlier, you know, this is really an area where people have to want it. People have to believe in it. People have to kind of buy into the idea of more restorative remedies rather than just traditional ideas of, for instance, deterrence or punishment. And so, for instance, you know, in this time of COVID, we've seen an uptick in anti-Asian type race discrimination. And even in talking to community members, in talking to people who have been affected by some sort of anti-Asian racism, you know, there's always the conversations that we have as to what is it that you're looking for? What are the demands? Whenever I think in the city, we see that there's an uptick in either, you know, anti-Semitism or anti-Black racism or you know, transphobic violence or xenophobic violence, you know, quite often there are communities where their kind of initial response is, is the city investigating this as a hate crime? Because I think traditionally a lot of communities think if something is being investigated as a hate crime, that means that government is giving what has happened the seriousness that it deserves, that it is focusing on the indignities to a group of people. And, you know, the Commission on Human Rights, I think, exists quite often in New York City as the alternative to that. What are other models that we can think of, so we're not just thinking about retribution or you know, punishment in a criminal legal system, but how do we also address bias incidents or hate, acts of hate that go beyond what a traditional criminal legal system offers? You know, so we have a few examples of this, and I'm going to bring up a few of the examples that I think have hit the news. You know, in February of 2019, we became the first jurisdiction to say unequivocally that, you know, any sort of bans in employment or public accommodations against natural Black hair or hairstyles traditionally worn by Black people, that constitutes race discrimination under our law. And one of the cases we had involved an upscale salon on the Upper East Side, where two of their Black employees, they were forced to wear their hair differently than their non-Black co-workers because it was Black hair. And so our law enforcement bureau got involved in that situation and worked with the complainants in that situation. And rather than looking at how we would levy civil penalties, which we're able to do up to $250,000 per discriminatory act under our law, rather than looking at civil penalties, we saw this as an opportunity to kind of change the industry, to have an opening to look at how hairstylists and how this sort of industry can open its mind up, and how it can open up its practices so that there were more Black hairstylists that had the opportunity to work at these types of salons, that these types of salons were actually trained in styling Black hair. So among the different remedies we included were instead of civil penalties, the salon having to create an internship program, working with a hairstyling school that specialized in styling Black hair, where their hairstylists would be trained by that hairstyling school, where we would also be, they would be working with a racial justice organization to better understand why such practices have such an impact on Black people and Black communities, and that they were also to be working within the hairstyling industry to combat race discrimination. And that was just some of the things that we came up with. In another case that hit the news, you know, I think people were aware that last year in January of 2019, Prada had come out with a new line that basically incorporated pretty obvious blackface imagery, and that line was displayed very prominently in stores. And in that situation, there was actually a complainant who was an attorney with CCR who came forward and filed a complaint with our agency. And when we were working through the resolution of that, with both the company and with the complainant, again, there was a great focus on how do we change the industry? How do we change the fashion industry to be more thoughtful about the ways that either through their product lines or through how they come up with marketing product lines and their fashion, that they really have to be more thoughtful about the ways in which they are incorporating racism and racist notions. And so again, in that situation, rather than levying civil penalties, instead it was agreed upon that the company would create a scholarship program, that they would create a position that reported directly to the CEO, and that position would have to really be focused on looking at diversity and inclusion principles, and have a real involvement in the creation of these types of lines, so that the sort of situation that happened with this product line wouldn't happen again in the future, and really force the company to create a commitment to recruit diverse people and people of color, so that you know, if there was more representation within the company, if there was more representation in the people who were involved in creating these lines, that again, something like this hopefully wouldn't happen in the future. I'll say too, just on what we're seeing today and the other work we do, a lot of what we do is law enforcement related, but there's also certainly a lot that we do in the Community Relations Bureau, where we are trying to get the community, New York City and its different communities as a whole, to also take accountability for the things that are happening in their community. You know, I remember being at a restorative justice training earlier this year, and something that somebody said really struck me. I remember there was a tribal elder who was talking, and what he said was, you know, I think about the accountability that I have for my community, and the question he put out there was, what did I have to not see or not do in order to have allowed what has happened in my community, whatever that ill was in my community? What did I not do or not see to have allowed this? And that's also very much kind of the idea behind what we do in the Community Relations Bureau. So up here is an example of, you know, in the last 5 weeks, again, when we've seen this increase in anti-Asian violence, we've had 5 different bystander intervention trainings, so that we are speaking to the broader community, whether it's in specific neighborhoods or if it's in New York City as a whole. You know, what should you be doing when you are witnessing, when you are part of the space where discrimination or harassment is occurring? How do you intervene in those situations safely? How do you stop that? How do you report to the agency? And I know I'm past my 1 minute, so I will park it there and I'll wait for questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I want to just tie a few things together, especially with our first panel, where Monifa ended with talking about scarcity. There's just some interesting things that we're hearing. I think that Erin was talking about, you know, what are we, it's not just about what we're abolishing, it's about what we're repairing, right? Like that focus on repairing, that focus on creating. I know Brett and Ivelyse, people are creating options. And I'm really excited by what Carmelyn is saying about affirmative action, which we have to take back that word and breathe it new life, because it is that affirmative movement that I think is just really important in what we create as lawyers. If we're going to be as lawyers, as advocates, as just people in our own community, what are you putting into the world? Not just what are you saying no to? What are we saying yes to? What is our affirmative vision for how we want to live? And how do we move away from all of this deficit focused work? And our whole, you know, all of our systems and our communities are really often resting on that deficit focused mentality that says no to this and no to that, and you get out of here, and push people away. And when it's very exciting to hear this cross-section panel talk about all the things that you are building. And one of the questions that keeps me up sometimes at night, people say, well, how are you going to scale this, right? Like, this is so much, don't you get that question, right? What are you going to do? Like, that's very sweet and all, it's very cute what you're doing, but like, how are you going to scale this? And so I'm really tired of being minimized in that way. And I want to put that question to the panel as we create and as we connect to create more and more and more. How do we scale it? And if there's a way to to dismiss this question and ask a better question, I ask you to do that too, because I actually am frustrated with the question itself. So give me a sign who wants to go first. I put this question to you. Ivelyse.
I get enraged by this question because when you talk about scaling, I think that's a very capitalistic, extractive framework of like, how can we take this and replicate it to increase revenue and profit? What I would say is, how do you support it, invest in it, and how do you invest in the people? So it's less about what do we do to make this go everywhere else, but like, how do you invest in the actual folks who are there? And, you know, I think the power of community and people, right? Like, we don't need a scale. We're moving now more and more to a hyper local focused, this idea of scale, I think, was never our community's intent, but something that's been placed on us from like capitalism and colonialism.
Thank you. Who's next? Who wants to take from Ivelyse? She's passing the baton. Anybody else want to get in on that one?
I'll just give a yes and I'm going to just go after other people to add, you know. I think I have written down Monifa's words about scarcity too. So thank you so much, Erika, for raising that. Simply the fact that we believe we still need these systems is a vision of the scarcity model. The idea that we have to scale it and design it is a version of the scarcity model, right? The idea is that we have it. We are already in abundance. And what we want is the scarcity model to be applied to the white supremacy that has stopped us from living in our full thriving space. And so that question, Erika, I agree with you. It is one of the most oppressive questions. It also shifts the burden on the single individual that answers the question when the question can never be answered by the individual. The question has already lived within the community. And it also shifts the burden often to Black and Brown people to be responsible for the immediate answer and success in a country, in a world where we have never had the power. And I would also ask people to say, you know what, guess what? The abundance is also in being generative and making mistakes and having the ability to, you know, learn from a process that didn't work too. So the idea of scaling something also, if you're going to even include that concept, you have to allow for the process to innovate. And I think oftentimes when people ask the question about scaling, they're asking for a perfect model to then replicate. And then when it needs innovation, like anything needs innovation, it becomes a judgment on it. So sure. So, you know, I agree with you, Erika. It is an incredibly triggering question. And the answer has so many layers. And I will say, think about Mimi Kim, think about Angela Davis, think about Insight. Like, I was just listening to their webinar yesterday. And so when you're thinking about that, and you want to know how to do this, go back to people like in Critical Resistance. Those people have been working on that forever.
I want to agree with almost everything you said there, Erin. Am I being heard? The scaling issue to me is also people looking for a blame for when whatever they try to do doesn't work. And I would rather you flip that question and not say, how can we scale this, but how can we learn from you what you did, how you did it, why you did it, and make it unique to our community. Just using our program, for example, it looks nothing like how the Navajo use it, but they keep coming every year because they see that there's some semblance of what we learned from them in Brooklyn. And if you look at our Syracuse program that's through our same organization, it's completely different than the Brooklyn one. So I would always just say, people ask you how do you scale it? Just flip that question back on them and just say, well, why aren't you coming here to learn from us and figure it out yourself? So.
I'm just going to chime in from the government perspective on this too. You know, so this is my first time in government. I've now been in this role for a little bit past 5 years, but I remember when I first came into government, you know, I would explain my experience to some people as, you know, it's this person who is like pulling this lever and you're like, what are you doing? And the person's saying, I'm making cheese. And you're looking at the other end and you see sausage and you're like, dude, that's not cheese, that's sausage. And it's in government, it's actually like talking about innovating, Erin, like it's radical to say, stop with the lever. Let's adjust some of the things in there. And then try it out again, and oh my God, that's the cheese. That's really cheese. And so I feel like what I find very exciting for me in local government is being around a lot of people who may or may not have been in government before, but are really excited to innovate within government. Like, you know, since this is my first time in the government space, I remember walking into places and, you know, expectations are generally low when you meet people from government. But then now, you know, I have the kind of the power of government on my shoulders, and that power comes with it, obviously, the great responsibility of showing up for my communities, showing up for all of our communities, and doing things radically different, maybe in some spaces, from what we've done in the past. So, so that was my government perspective.
Thanks everybody for taking my trigger and running with it. I really appreciate that. I want to shift gears because we have a little bit time left, and I just want to be able to animate for people. Sometimes when we talk in these spaces that are very creative, if you haven't accessed them, you don't really understand what people are talking about. So I'm going to ask you, if you could, to talk about, I also think this work starts personally, either in your community or with yourself. So if you have any stories that you want to share that will really just animate for people what this means, a story of either someone you witnessed or yourself, or, you know, in your organization, something that will show people what you're really talking about, or a short story. We have a little bit of time left, but if anybody has one to share, I think it'll help. Anyone feeling? Sherry? Brett?
I don't know if this is going to be on point, but I think one thing both of us learned in doing the peacemaking program is you have to put your ego aside when you're trying to learn this stuff, especially as lawyers. A lot of stuff didn't seem right or sound right to us, but we trusted it. And so if you're trying to change something, you can't make it feel comfortable, and it can't just fit into your preconceived conceptions of what it's supposed to be. And just trust the process. And as you know, what we always told everyone that kind of tried to downplay what we were doing, we just would always tell them, trust the circle. So.
Thanks, Brett. Anybody want to share a story of like a, and Erin, go ahead.
I don't know if this is what you want me to say, but I'm gonna say what I want to say. I will share a story of just being a Black female attorney coming from Baltimore City with no one that was lawyers around me. And the challenge it was for me to code switch, the challenge it was for me to like try to use this language that wasn't built for me to access justice for my people. And so what I really wanted to say to anyone who is I can't see anyone in the audience right now. If you're in a person of privilege, if you have white privilege, I really ask you to step back and listen. I think if you are someone who is struggling with accessing that and feeling like, wow, this doesn't really fit what I thought, like believe in that, because I think what we hear today is that is the innovation, that is the change, that radical thing. What makes you feel insecure when you're trying to access change and access solutions? As a young attorney, or I don't know, any level attorney, when you're a person of color, that discomfort is exactly what we are trying to sit in right now and say, no, it's not discomfort. Like that's your power. That's your superpower. Grab it, hold on to it. And maybe that's not the story you want me to tell, but that's the story I want to say today.
Anybody else? I'm going to move on. Should I move on? Thank you, Erin. I think we're hearing a lot about discomfort as generative, as, you know, I think that's what Brett's talking about too. It's like, you don't have to know, this idea that we have to know that we are the expert, Ivelyse. I mean, I think that's what a lot of this restorative work is doing, is saying, move back, listen. You know, it's not that you're not the expert, it's that there aren't experts. So stop waiting for somebody else to solve your problem, and start listening and building that movement. I want to talk, if we have an extra minute, Joanne, I want to talk about how you bring the collective. So Carmelyn, I know that you have done that in your work, and maybe we'll start with you, but people just don't do that. They don't say that as a group, you have to do better. They don't talk about, these are the conditions that you have brought that have fostered harm. And yes, there is maybe some individual harm that has to take accountability, but there are conditions that enabled it. And those conditions go back into our first panel, right? That's like, the small person and the group of neighbors or family members, and then there's who's around them, and then there's the generations, and then there's the ancestors, right? We don't do that in general. And in your work, I see you doing that. And I wonder if you could start and just talk to us a little bit, both about, you know, what does it mean to create measures that do that bird's eye view and bring other people in? Everyone is hiding from responsibility all the time instead of modeling responsibility. So how do you do that? And what are the challenges?
Sure. You know, like I said earlier, our agency is modeled so it has both this law enforcement piece, but it also has this community relations or educational component. And I think, honestly, I think the educational component is so incredibly important. Otherwise, if we just have that law enforcement piece, right, we are seeing the same things kind of replay over and over and over again. You know, notwithstanding our you know, accessing more restorative remedies and settlement and conciliations and decisions and orders, but still there is only a part of it that could be accomplished, right, through law enforcement. And so, you know, what we started doing in the last 5 years is creating more of a focus, not just on like, what's your rights under the law or what are your obligations under the law, but things that sometimes people think of as more kind of cultural competency or understanding of intergroup relationships and intergroup dynamics. And I think that, especially if we're talking about New York City, that is such an important thing to talk about, because New York City has so many people represented, so many different languages are spoken here, so many, the diversity of the world exists. You know, I could go to Queens and they speak more languages in Queens than they speak at any other one location, right, anywhere else on the earth. And so when you're looking at like, how do you understand wrongs, bias-based wrongs or discriminatory-based wrongs, we can't really seek to address those issues only through law enforcement and not expect that we're not going to see that again if we're not also in communities talking about like, what's the root of it? You know, one of the things I think that is so important about this particular moment where there's this focus on like racial disparities in health and racial disparities generally in the COVID crisis is looking at like, what's the importance of the data that's coming out of this? And the importance that I think of it from the government perspective is, what do we do with that information that we get so that when we're not in a COVID related situation, we are using that information to change policy, to change practice, and to educate within communities. And that is a lot of the work that my folks do kind of on the day-to-day. You know, we have a staff that speak over 30 languages and are incredibly representative of the different communities in New York City. I mean, personally for me, my desire to come into government was, you know, I'm a queer Filipinx chick with a biracial family. People generally don't think that that's the person leading a government agency. And I'm in every day, not these days, but when I'm in like community spaces or schools, wow, the kind of light bulbs that go off over people's head, the smiles that come across people when they're thinking, wow, you can grab power in that same way. You can change the system by being representative in the system, or just like any of the folks on this panel, maybe the existing structures weren't working for them and the messages that they were trying to create or instill within their system. So Erin starts her own organization. Ivelyse starts her own company. You know, it's Brett and his organization, you know, start a new model. I mean, I think that so much of what we try to do from the government space is help empower communities to say that you can do this too. And there's actually somebody in government who will be there to support you in that work.
Thank you so much. I think we're almost out of time. Joanne, I'm out of time, right? I just want to thank this panel. I have to do this, but can we just have one word from each panelist to close this creative, affirming, imaginative exploration of law and our society and our world? So Ivelyse, can I start with you?
Sure. The one word that I'm thinking of is change, in the spirit of Octavia Butler.
Awesome. Thank you. Erin?
I'm going to go for abundance.
Thank you. Carmelyn?
My go-to is compassion.
Brett, can you close us out?
Unite.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks. Joanne, over to you. Oh, and our last RJ 2020. I had to say that, right? That is our CLE. Our CLE word is, you're muted, Joanne, if you want to get on. Our CLE word is RJ 2020, and thank you for having me, Joanne.
Thanks,
Yes.
Erika.
So, I'm going to pick up that thread and just say my one word right now is grateful. And thank you so much to you, Erika, Brett, Erin, Ivelyse, Carmelyn, for such an excellent discussion and for really bringing a concreteness and nuance to the discussion of how we can include principles of restoration and reconciliation and truth and power shifting in the work that we're doing as lawyers and as organizers. We returned in this final panel to some of the themes that we were introduced by Margaret Burnham this morning in her excellent keynote remarks, in which Manifa, Justin, Wade, Ruben, and Nadia explored as well, kind of the limits and the possibilities of law and human rights law in particular. So I have learned a ton. I'm humbled and motivated, as always, when I am in community with all of you. And I'm excited to think about how we can use our voice and share our power and the privilege that we do have to put forward a proactive vision of human rights. So thank you very much. Be well and safe. And we hope to see you all in person sometime soon.